Are you a prepper or homesteader looking to connect with like-minded people in your area? Looking to start your own preparedness group? Already have a group? Well, look no further than PrepperNet. PrepperNet is dedicated to personal responsibility, individual freedoms, and being self-reliant. PrepperNet has monthly meetings in over 100 cities where you can meet and learn with like-minded people in your area. PrepperNet, where preppers unite. Find us online at preppernet.com.
Survive, thrive, stay alive. It's time to get prepared with the Prepping Academy podcast.
Hello everyone, this is Patrick, in for another episode of Grid Down, Comms Up on the Prepping Academy podcast. This episode, we are going to finish up the last segments of things that we learned during Hurricane Helene. Now, about 6 months later, I'm finally getting to this, so appreciate you guys being patient. And today we're going to get into some of the nerd stuff. So if you're not into the nerd stuff, I apologize, but I think there's some valuable things to be learned here from an operational perspective that impact our ability to communicate during a disaster, especially when we have to impromptu spin up a larger operation or onboard a lot of people in our community that don't have previous radio experience. That being said, I want to pause just a minute here to bring you guys up to speed and tell you about a couple of different things. The Eastern Tennessee Homestead Alliance Festival will be going on in Townsend, Tennessee in September on Friday the 12th and Saturday the 13th of September this year, 2025. I will be a guest speaker there, so if you want to come out, say howdy. I will be there talking about Hurricane Helene and communications, I believe. But it's a great event. It's a family-friendly event. There's stuff for kids to do. There's fun stuff to check out if you're into homesteading. Last year, we had a blast. It was a great event. So I want to encourage you guys, if you're in the area or within driving distance, to come check it out. And it's in Townsend, Tennessee, which is just an absolutely gorgeous place. So I encourage you guys, come pay a visit, come check it out. I also want to give a shout out to Glenn and Shelby over at Prepping 2.0. They announced that they would be winding down their podcast and kind of moving on to do some other things at this point. I just wanted to say thank you to them and to the great contribution that they've made to the prepping world in the past years of doing their podcast, and just acknowledge that they've been a great contributor to all of us and had an excellent show that's been enjoyed by many. And I want to wish them a great time in the things that they're headed off to do now and the opportunities that God has put in front of them. A lot of times we do things for a certain season and then we get steered in another direction to move on to other things. So I want to wish them well, just say thanks to them. If you listen to that podcast, I'd give them a shout out on social media and say thank you to them for all the hard work and effort they've put into that over the past years. Now, I'm just going to dive right in to the notes that I made during the hurricane. I wrote down several pages of stuff while I was deployed and while I was doing a lot of different work and dealing with different issues and some of the things that came up. And we're going to work through those today, and we're going to talk about some of the things. And I think many of you who have spent any time around me or been on the radio with me and participated in a lot of things know that I am not a fan of the Baofeng UV5R. It has a lot of shortcomings in its operation and in its capabilities. However, it was the most common radio that we saw while we were on the ground. They were everywhere. I cannot tell you how many Baofengs that I programmed over a few weeks while I was doing different things. They were far and above the most commonly seen communications device being used in the impacted area. And they were, of course, because they were the most commonly seen device, they were also the most frequently misprogrammed, broken, and misused device. out there as well. So if you are like me and you don't like bow things, I would still encourage you to learn how to use them and program them, because in a disaster, you're going to be doing a lot of that if you're a radio person, if you understand what's going on, because most of the people that were showing up with them didn't know how to use them, didn't have them programmed right. They certainly didn't have them programmed right for the area that they were in, and they didn't know some of the operational tricks to being able to successfully communicate in a grid down. You know, it's one thing when you're out playing with your buddies in the field doing training and somebody ends up accidentally flipping from VFO A to VFO B. On the screen you got two frequencies that you can flip back and forth, and they flip to the wrong one because they're working or they're playing or they're training or doing something, and it gets bumped. And then the next thing you know, you're talking to them, they hear you, and they're pushing the push-to-talk button and transmitting on the wrong thing. And we saw that happen so many times, to the point where we actually had to have a meeting about it early on with all the volunteers and encourage them to, A, use their keypad lock, and B, put the same thing on both VFOs. I know when you're working, it's really tempting to want to listen to something else that might have something cool or useful on it that's just something to monitor where other things are going on. But the problem becomes when you accidentally end up transmitting on that frequency, and maybe it's a frequency you're not authorized to be on, maybe there are issues with you being there, or it's just that your teammates are trying to get a hold of you and you're in the wrong place and can't reach them. And that can be in a situation that is a true disaster when you're doing recovery work, when there's heavy equipment around, when there's dangerous stuff going on. Not being able to reach you, not being able to account for you can cause mobilization to go look for you. So don't be that guy that everybody stops working to go hunt for because they're not working their radio correctly and have been out of contact for 2 hours, and everyone wants to know, are they lying underneath a tree in a ditch somewhere? So, make sure you know how to use that and be familiar with those aspects of your radios. The other thing I want to bring up, kind of related, not just to bow things, but to all radios, as we talk about accessories. When you're using stuff hard, accessories get broken. And one of the most common things that I've seen throughout my career in radio professionally is antennas fail all the time. An antenna is a consumable item. They deteriorate from UV exposure. They deteriorate from being flexed and bent all the time, and they will fail. So having extra rubber ducky, the little flexible antennas, is a important thing. Another thing that I will add to that is, and this is kind of a technical little bit thing, there's a lot of, in the prepping world and the preparedness world, attitude that bigger is better. You should run the big, long signal sticks or Nagoya antennas, which I got one of those, and the first time I took it in the field, I broke it. So, I got hung on a tree when I was felling a tree and bent the antenna over. Anyway, I like the signal sticks for that application. But people go with, longer is better because it gets them more range. And it does. But if you don't need that range, longer also gets hung on everything. It pokes you. It gets yanked off your belt and your gear by sticks and twigs when you're in the forest. It gets slammed in the truck door. It sometimes having a shorter antenna when you're working, if it does what you need, is better. So something to consider there as you're selecting your gear. If you need that, then use it. If you don't, then maybe use a shorter antenna. Another aspect is speaker mics. If you're not familiar with speaker mics are the remote microphone and speaker that you see people clipped on their shirt or their collar, so they can wear the radio on their belt, but they can have the microphone up near their ear. That's very common in any kind of work, really, when people are using radios at work, because oftentimes you're in a noisy environment and you don't hear or can't hear easily the radio that's on your belt while you're working. And having that up by your head where your ears are is critical, and it also allows you to respond quickly because you don't have to fumble and get the radio off your belt and get it up to your mouth. You just reach over and smash the push to talk button on the speaker mic and you can talk. Another pro tip here, I know a lot of folks on the internet, they see the guys running around with the 3M tactical headsets that cost $600, $700, $800 depending on the configuration, so they can run their radios and their hearing protection and all that stuff at once. And if that's in your budget and you want to look like you're straight out of Fallujah, then knock yourself out. However, a lot of us don't have that in the budget, or it's just not suitable for the situation that we're in. Another quick tip that you can do is most quality speaker mics have a 1/8 inch headphone connector on the bottom of them or the side of them, and you can plug an earbud into it. You can pick up really cheap mono earbuds on eBay or Amazon for almost nothing. So get a bunch of them because they're not very good quality and they'll break. But you can plug one of those into the speaker mic, into the headphone jack, and then you put that in your ear, and then you put your hearing protection over your ears, and now you have, a poor man's way of being able to listen to the radio while you're in a loud piece of machinery or running a chainsaw or, doing anything else where that you need to be able to hear the radio, but you can't hear it over the noise. And that's a really cheap way to get into that kind of solution. So something to consider and maybe add to your plans and your equipment list, especially when, you're doing those sorts of things. It also gives you a little bit of discretion because when you plug those in, the only person that hears the radio is you. And depending on situation, that might be good if you're trying to, do noise discipline or things like that. Now, I'm going to pick on a little bit Anytone radios here. This is Anytone. Don't sue me. This is not an issue with Anytones. They make pretty good gear, and it works well. This applies not just to Anytones, but my experience was with Anytones in this situation because there were a lot of them around. But the same could be said of Motorola or commercial Kenwood radios or ICOM commercial stuff. Anything that requires a proprietary software to program during a situation where you don't have the internet, you can't get to chase down all the software and all the things that are needed to program some of this stuff, becomes a real headache, especially when you have a different piece of software for every radio and you're trying to match and figure all that stuff out. It ends up being a time suck to program gear. And we had a lot of equipment, some of which was donated, that was Anytone, and I spent the better part of a couple of days programming radios. One, because DMR radios program a little different, even if you're doing analog, and people that only have experience programming with like chirp or simple Baofeng amateur radio type programming stuff often struggle with commercial radio type programming. So that's something to keep in mind as well is, make sure your radios are something that either you can program and you have everything you need with you to program, or that you've kind of agreed on something or settled on something if you're going to have to ask for help programming that can be programmed with, there's a free piece of software called Chirp. It can program hundreds of different radios, and most people that are into radio have used Chirp at some point and are familiar with it. So if you need help, your radio can be programmed with Chirp. It's really easy to program from one radio to another with that software.
Hey, let's take a quick break.
Are you a prepper or homesteader looking to connect with like-minded people in your area? Looking to start your own preparedness group? Already have a group? Well, look no further than PrepperNet. PrepperNet is dedicated to personal responsibility, individual freedoms, and being self-reliant. PrepperNet has monthly meetings in over 100 cities where you can meet and learn with like-minded people in your area. PrepperNet, where preppers unite. Find us online at preppernet.com.
Without having to bang out a complete new program in a piece of software that's unique to the radio. with an Anytone or Motorola or whatever. That's why that on the wildfire grounds, Bendix King radios, BK radios, tend to be king because they have the ability, and no pun intended there, they have the ability to share zones either with a cable, or I think the new ones can do it with Bluetooth, where you can share the program for this particular disaster, this particular activation, just by syncing the two radios together and sharing that zone. And that's a huge time saver. And it means that, even the radio tech doesn't have to be there to do it. Just two guys in the field can swap programming real quick with those radios. And that's why they're loved in that area. So similar things in kind of the amateur disaster preparedness realm are kind of underway with a few new radios, and you'll probably hear some more about that as it goes on from me. But that's something kind of coming to our world as well. So make sure you do have the programming stuff and the things you need, especially if you're coming and deploying somewhere to help with a disaster and you're bringing one of those radios. Bring your stuff to program it. Don't expect that somebody there is going to have it. Now, I'm going to move on to a bit of a controversial issue, and my opinion on this actually changed quite a bit during Hurricane Helene, and it has to do with something called the Mars modification on amateur radio. And what Mars modification really is it's opening the radio up to transmit outside of the amateur bands. And those radios are not legally allowed. They're not type accepted outside of the amateur bands. And there's a variety of reasons for that we're not going to go into here. But it was a very commonly performed mod during the hurricane because a lot of people, when you went to a community, the common radio service that was in use by communities was the Family Radio Service, or FRS. And we'll talk a bit more about that later. But a lot of people were using their amateur radios, because it was all they had with them, to communicate with other people in their community on FRS. And in order to do that, they had to mod their radios to work outside of band on the FRS radios. So, I would have years ago said, don't Mars mod your radios, because it opens up the door to accidentally transmitting somewhere that you're not allowed to, especially as a new person. And I would still say as a new person, this is something to be very careful of. But I think in a disaster like this, being able to do that it potentially saved lives. So it would maybe be a good idea to have at least one radio, if not some of your radios that can do that. I will kind of warn everybody with that, is a lot of folks kind of get into radio and they're learning. You can get away with a lot with a handheld radio because the handheld radio antennas are very inefficient. They're very low gain or even negative gain. It's related to a dipole. And that causes them to be very broadbanded. So you'll have a handheld that has an antenna that can be used in the commercial bands, in GMRS, FRS, and in amateur bands, and it works just fine and won't hurt the radio. When you move into mobile radios, more powerful radios, 50-watt radios you would put in your truck or at home, and you're running antennas that have antenna gain, they're putting more radio energy towards the horizon, those antennas get narrower, and they may only work in one service. They may only be serviceable just in the amateur bands, or just in the GMRS/commercial bands, or just in that 450 to 460 megahertz commercial spectrum. So make sure your antennas are proper for the band that you're using if you're doing that. Otherwise, you can burn up your radio eventually. And that actually is going to bring me to something further down my list that we're going to talk about now, as we're talking about burning up radios. It is very tempting, particularly in VHF and UHF, when you're in the field, you're setting something up really quick, you need to get on the air. You just put an antenna up, hook it to the radio, and roll with it. And I've done that. I do that with some of my gear. I trust my gear quite a bit because I use it and I go through it and I take fairly meticulous care of it. However, if you're pooling resources with other people, you have new gear coming on scene, all that kind of stuff, I would strongly suggest that once you put your antennas up, you either use a network analyzer or even a watt meter to make sure that your antenna is a good match for your radio and that you do not have an improper radio match. Because I discovered after our deployment that there was a ground plane antenna up that we were using for GMRS, and it had a damaged end connector on it that was not making up correctly with the coax, and we had probably been running that radio into a bad load the entire time we were there. It also probably had a bit to do with some of our coverage issues with that radio as well. So it does pay to check your stuff. In a hurry, it's tempting to just skip that step, but make sure, because if you do smoke a radio during an emergency, getting a replacement may be difficult and time-consuming. So protect your gear, do the testing that you need to do, and make sure everything's is good. And I'll tell you what, if some of you guys want it, hit me up, and I'll post a video on my @GridDownCommsUp YouTube channel about how to measure antennas and make sure that they're okay. And I'll do it with a watt meter and with like a nano VNA or something. But anyway, kind of moving on. We hinted at this earlier about using keypad locks. So here's a couple of other pro tips from someone who's been in the field. Every good radio that I have used has a way to lock the keypad. So if it's in your pocket or it's on your web gear and you push buttons accidentally, it doesn't change frequencies, it doesn't change functions, it doesn't do something you don't want it to do. I would learn how to do that on my particular radio and get good at it and remember how to lock and unlock it, because it's something you need to do when you're working with a radio and it's on you. Otherwise, you will get bumped off frequency. If your radio has a analog knob for changing channels, one that you rotate rather than a button that you push, sometimes those knobs get rotated. Even if the keypad lock is on, some radios don't lock that knob, and they'll get rotated and you can end up off frequency. Well, a little pro tip, and this also works for the volume knob, because I cannot tell you how many times that while working, my volume has gotten turned down on my radio, is a piece of electrical tape. Keep a roll of electrical tape stuck in your gear, and when you set your radio up in the morning, you set the volume where you want it, you put it on the channel you want, just take a piece of electrical tape and stick it around the volume knob or the VFO to keep it in place. Same kind of concept that guys who run exposed turrets on rifle scopes use, where they'll put a piece of tape around the exposed turret to keep it from turning when it bumps into their gear. You can do the same thing with a radio. So just a little pro tip there that will maybe help you from being the guy that everyone comes searching for, not because he's on the wrong channel, but because his radio's turned down and he doesn't hear anybody. I can tell you from running some big events that every year when I'm running a fairly big event with about 30 to 40 radios deployed to people that are new to radio, for the most part, that somebody bumps the volume knob and turns it down and we have to go find them. Again, don't be that guy. So another item on my list of kind of nerdy things that you need to be aware of is misprogrammed radios. So when you have a lot of people programming a lot of radios coming into a new area, they're in a hurry, maybe they don't do their final testing of the radios to make sure they're programmed correctly, you end up with radios that are programmed incorrectly. How they're programmed incorrectly can vary. They can be misprogrammed in that there's a typo and there's a digit wrong in the frequency, and they're not even on the right frequency. It can be that the tone that is needed to operate the equipment is programmed incorrectly. Or it can be something maybe even a little less obvious. So for those of you that are new, when you're using something called a repeater, which is a mountaintop device that listens on one frequency, retransmits on another frequency at the same time, your radio transmits on what's the input frequency when you hit the push-to-talk button. And when you let off the push-to-talk button, it goes back to listening to the output frequency of the repeater, so you hear what other people are saying on the input. How a repeater works in summary. And you can end up not programming the offset correctly, which is the difference between those two frequencies, and end up having issues accessing. Or you can accidentally program it so you're using just the output frequency, which means that the repeater doesn't hear you. People who are listening to the repeater and are in simplex range or radio-to-radio range do hear you, but your range is greatly reduced. And we had that issue very early on with a radio that was misprogrammed, and it was very important radio that was misprogrammed and wasn't getting into the repeater. It was just on the repeater output. And everybody that was within maybe we were in an okay location, maybe 5 to 7 miles of us could hear, no problem. But if you got further out, then they didn't hear you because you weren't on the repeater. And anyway, we figured that out. I figured that out on my first trip up, and we got that resolved real quick. But, be on the lookout for misprogrammed stuff. I've seen that happen many, many times at events and other things where there's a radio that's got a programming problem that shows up. And as Murphy would always show up and have it, that radio always ends up with the most important person to communicate to in the situation. So just be aware of that. So those are some of the things that we learned early on. Another thing that I want to talk about, and this is, I don't want to bash Chinese radios on this, but this is some Chinese radio, or maybe I should say this is a cheap radio problem. That might be the better way to put it. During a disaster, especially if you're working with a group and you are the person that's running the radios in the Tactical Operations Center or the Emergency Operations Center or whatever, radio's audio quality matters because you're listening to it for hours on end, and the ability to understand what is being said to you by someone on the other end when your ears are fried from listening to, you've got a headache and you're sleep deprived and you're wired on coffee is important, because if you miss something, you have to get people to repeat it, or you might not hear it altogether. And that is an issue with a lot of radios. As we showed up, our talk radios kind of evolved from some very, very crappy Chinese stuff to some better quality Chinese stuff, such as the I think it's the UV50X2, and then eventually to some true dual band VFO radios, the Yaesu FTM 400s that we were running. And with each step, the audio quality got a lot better. And an example of this even would be GMRS. I don't remember what the first GMRS radio we had was. It was some inexpensive import radio. And that radio was very hard to understand what people were saying. The audio was kind of muddy. It was plenty loud. It just wasn't intelligible. And I swapped that radio out pretty early on with one of my commercial radios. I brought a Kenwood TK860G, I believe it was, with me. And those were commercial UHF radios. Saw a lot of work 20 years ago in the fire and ambulance service. So there's a lot of them out there. They're good radios. And when we hooked that radio up, the audio quality turned heads. I mean, you could be across the room and understand clear as day what the person on the other end was saying, no question asked, as opposed to having to stand over the radio and try to figure out what they were saying, especially if they were in a noisy environment. So those sorts of things matter. And if you've never heard a good quality, good sounding radio, then sometimes it's hard to understand that if your experience is limited. But that's just something to be aware of. Another issue we ran into kind of related to that with I think it was the UV, it was either a UV 425 or 250, was the way that the dual VFO on those radios work. And it was very frustrating because if you're trying to dual monitor, if you were, in our case, we were monitoring a ham radio repeater and we were monitoring the FRS channel that we were using out in the distribution yard. And if somebody keyed up on, say, another, like, for example, if someone transmitted in the yard on the GMRS side while we were trying to carry on a conversation on the amateur radio side, it would mute up the amateur radio side and drag us off to the new signal. And then you ended up not hearing the rest of what you were being told that was critical on the amateur radio side. So if you have radios like that, I know that supposedly you can monitor multiple things, but you really can't. You can only monitor one active thing at a time. So, it may work for you driving around just casually listening, but in a working environment, you need to be able to hear everything all at the same time, which puts you to having radios that truly can either play both audio at the same time or just using multiple radios. And that's something I have always been a bit of a fan of. I do have people that have asked me, hey, what about like a Yaesu FT, was it 990, 991, the shack in a box that does HF and VHF and UHF amateur radio stuff? Well, that's cool if you need a single box to carry around with you, portable or that kind of thing, want to install in your truck, and you understand the limitations. But in an actual emergency, you're going to want to listen to maybe something on VHF and something on UHF and something on HF all at the same time. But when you stuff all that stuff in the same radio, you're limited to only listening to one of them at a time. And that is a massive limitation. So be careful of hamstringing yourself that way in an effort to maybe try to save some money or something when you're getting started. I get it. All of us have limitations, but I would encourage you to work around those as quickly as you can. And find, I have a GMRS radio setting in front of me now that I paid $15 for. It's a Motorola Max Track, the 2-channel Max Track. It sets on one repeater. That's all it does. It costs like $15. So there's ways to work around some of that stuff. If you're smart, and as you learn, and as you get more familiar with this communication stuff, there's oftentimes ways to make stuff work. So one other issue I want to dive down here as well is the ability to adjust on the fly. Now, I like my commercial radios, my Kenwoods and my Motorola's and that kind of stuff, all well and good, and they're great radios, and I use a lot of them. But in a disaster, oftentimes you got to be able to change something on the fly. New frequency. Hey, everybody, we're moving here, and you need to reprogram. Well, with Motorola, that's going to involve a laptop, the right CSS, and the right programming cable to even get started. And, I guess you can do that, but you need to be able to make adjustments on the fly in a disaster or an emergency, because it is a constantly evolving situation, and what was the case yesterday may not be the case today, and what was the case this morning may not be the case this afternoon as the situation changes, because remember, you are a support person in the radio world, and the mission changes and evolves, and you've got to continue to support that. And oftentimes the mission changes and evolves in ways that require you to pivot on a dime. So be sure that you're able to do that, and that you're able to function off-grid and do that effectively without inducing additional operational drag. There's enough operational drag as there is. Another example of this, and I'm going to bust on JS8 call for HF. Some of you guys that do HF are looking at me with daggers now. If you don't do HF, you don't know what JS8 call is. It's a weak signal mode that is fairly slow, but allows you to send text from location to location with very minimal signal that would never support voice and, frankly, never support faster digital modes. It's a really cool mode, but it does have an Achilles heel, and that is that it requires everything to be time synced. The station that is transmitting and the receiving station need to have a time sync, which is easily doable with GPS, and it's easily doable with network time if you're on the internet. The problem is when you go into the backcountry after a disaster and there is no internet, that leaves you with GPS. And if your GPS works, then all is great and good. If it doesn't, then you have to manually do a time sync. And I'm not going to go into that with JS8 right now. But the problem appears because people are used to the time sync happening automatically. They don't have to think about it. Then when it stops working, they have a moment of, or sometimes a permanent moment of, I can't figure out why this is working. I've just got to pivot to something else, rather than realizing, oh yes, my time sync isn't working and I'm going to have to figure out a way to get a time sync from another signal, assuming you have another signal, which can also be an issue during a disaster. There may not be that many people on the air transmitting that you can sync to. It's something to keep in mind as you're developing your systems and tools with your group and your response. Oftentimes there are things that seem easy and work great that really don't work during an emergency. And that's one of the reasons that you've got to get out there and train. You got to go practice. You got to do this stuff. You got to simulate the real situation. Don't go out and use your cell phone to sync the time on your computer while that you're in the field. Assume that that's not going to work and figure out another way. That said, some other things that we ran into that I want to pass along kind of in this episode of things were radio discretion and use of pro words. Now, in the amateur bands, you're not really allowed to, you're not supposed to obscure the meaning of your transmission. That's one of the things about amateur radio being open and public and for experimentation and learning. It's not a commercial radio service. It's not intended for your private communications. But during a disaster, there are situations where you may want to use discretion about what you say on the radio. It's not necessarily the time to give out certain information. But we also saw that sometimes you just got to do what you got to do. In Asheville, they were reporting bodies in trees and stuff like that on amateur radio where everybody could hear it. And those are, you have to understand the situation you're in when you're doing that kind of stuff, as well as there may be sensitive political things going on between communities and other things that you need to have a way to discreetly, ask, hey, I need somebody to come get me because the situation isn't safe. And you don't want to just say that on the radio. So, have a plan before you go into those situations. Have a safe word, as it were, so that if something does go sideways and you need to discreetly say, I need exfil now, that you've got a way to do it. Have a plan, have a well-written communications plan during a disaster before you go out into the field, because you're not going to be able to put it together once you're in the field, and cover some of the bizarre bases that you don't think that you're going to need, because things get weird sometimes is the best way that I can put it here in the podcast. is things got weird, and we needed, a way to communicate certain things at times, and you had to have a plan for that. And we kind of got caught off guard initially, didn't have a plan for that, and then had to implement a plan because, again, we didn't think that during a disaster things were going to get that weird. So make sure that you do have those sorts of plans, and you have a communications plan with pro words and those sorts of things laid out. This is also another case for data over radio, using digital modes, and I don't mean like digital voice like DMR or those sorts of things. I mean text over radio, like sending a fax over the radio. Having the ability to do that, frankly, eliminates probably 85% of the listening audience instantly. So if you need to send something from one point to another, you can send it, unencrypted, fully legal on amateur radio, but most people are just not set up to do that. And you've just eliminated most people by going to a digital mode. The other thing that goes along with that is it's faster. You can move accurate, checksummed, precise information really fast with digital modes, like hundreds of words, up to probably over 1,000 words a minute in digital modes, perfectly relayed from one end to the other. So in a emergency, sometimes when airtime is in high demand, because there's so many people with emergency traffic, there's so much stuff going on, rather than spending 20 minutes on the repeater hand relaying a bunch of frequencies for different communities and having to repeat 4 or 5 times to make sure everyone got a good copy, if it's just you to another person, do it with data, because you can send it all in like 5 seconds and it's gone and it's done and you're moving on. That's why I push being familiar with data modes, because it gives you some discretion. It also gives you speed. And in an emergency, speed increases your effectiveness and the amount of work that you can get done in a day. It also, in other situations where maybe you don't want to be on the air for a long time, reduces the amount of time that you're on the air for someone to locate you if you are in a more non-conventional situation. So that's a valuable skill. All the software, everything that you need to do, it's free for the most part, and you just have to buy some interface cabling. So there's nothing stopping you other than the will and the time to learn how to do that stuff. So encourage you to do that kind of thing. Plus, between me and you and nobody else that's listening, when the grid goes down, if you are the end of the world as we know it or without rule of law type person and you are preparing for that, if you know how to use this stuff and you're sending text, adding encryption to it's no problem. You just encrypt the text. One-time pads, paranoia text encryption, whatever. And then once there's no law about sending encrypted stuff, because there is no law left, you can send encryption all day long if you want to, just by layering that on top of skills that you already have. And that also builds a very important aspect of tradecraft, where that you are involved and you are touching every step of that encryption to verify that it is working correctly. Because so many times in the commercial communications, the law enforcement world, those sorts of things, where we depend on all the encryption to be taken care of by the electronics in the background, sometimes something goes wrong and you aren't aware of it and it's not encrypted anymore. And that causes a lot of problems at times, and especially in very dangerous, very high-risk situations. So being, in touch with every step of the way there, it reduces the likelihood of those sorts of things happening. Whereas if you're just depending on that little circle on the screen of the radio to tell you you're encrypted, yeah, great, you may be encrypted, but what about the guy transmitting back to you, So just something to keep in mind. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about, we're going to get way into the nerddom side of things, and we're actually going to talk about some stuff that I have taught in a number of kind of more advanced communications classes, and you guys are going to get it for free here, because I think it's something valuable that a lot of folks maybe don't understand. If you're not into radio, I apologize. I hope that you maybe glean some useful stuff from this. But some of it's without context, maybe going to be a little tough. So these are just some things we ran into improvising and operating on the go that I made note of that were valuable. So first, everybody that's got some radio experience knows that when it comes to the line of sight radio bands, everything above 30 megahertz, height is might. And that means the higher up your antenna is, the further your signal is going to go. So we struggled. We put PVC pipe sections together. We put whatever we could find together to improvise getting antennas higher in locations that we needed to get them higher in, so we had a better footprint. And that's something to prepare for. And I'm going to tell you guys a little tip that I use. So if you're using a lightweight antenna, such as a little wire ground plane or a little Ed Fong J-pole in a PVC pipe, something that doesn't weigh very much, a painter's pole that you can pick up at Home Depot for $50 is a great way to get your antenna 25 feet up in the air. A 24-foot painter's pole works great for that. I have a mount that I built that I can stuff in the trailer hitch of my pickup truck to set up a 24-foot painter's pole and hang an antenna off of it for some extra height. There are people that also use sections of surplus aluminum military mast pieces that they used to put up tarps and all kinds of stuff in the military. And there are commercial solutions to this. A company called Wilbert makes push-up masts. They also make pneumatic ones that have to be mounted to a trailer or something like a truck, something like that will go up 100 feet. And there are crank-up towers that are mounted on trailers. Another quick and dirty one, you happen to have a disaster relief ministry and you're trying to figure out how can I get my antenna higher, and you've got a light plant, the things you see parked along the side of the interstate at night with the little generator running the lights so they can see to work at night. Well, those things go up 16, 18 feet when you crank the lights up. So figure out a way to mount an antenna on top of that to get some extra height. Now, there are certain ones of those I might discourage that because the lights make a lot of radio frequency noise and can cause problems. But, that's potentially an improvised solution there to get some extra height on your antennas. Keep those things in mind that you want height. Another issue that we ran into, so Hurricane Helene was different than a lot of emergencies. There was so much damage to roads and infrastructure compared to your typical tornado or hurricane that it made getting anywhere difficult at times. And there were a lot of people using UTVs because UTVs could go places that vehicles simply wouldn't go anymore. Well, then you find yourself, well, how do I mount a radio to a UTV? Because my handheld radio just doesn't have the power to get it done. I need more power and I need a better antenna. So how do I mount an antenna to a UTV that's just got a roll cage and a fiberglass roof on it? Because I can't use a magnetic mount. And I can't, use a lot of the traditional mounting solutions because, one, they won't stick. And two, I don't have a ground plane for my antenna, so it's not going to work. Well, there is a solution for that. Been around for a very long time. So antennas such as half-wave antennas do not require a ground plane. If you give them a ground plane, you will actually get some positive antenna gain, but if you don't, then you just get basically a dipole. for use that doesn't need a ground plane. So if you don't have a half-wave, no ground plane VHF antenna, or UHF if you're operating in UHF, in your kit, most of the major antenna manufacturers make them. I encourage you to buy commercial antennas, not necessarily amateur radio antennas, just because the durability when they're getting smacked by tree limbs and pulled on and beat and all that kind of stuff tends to be a lot better with commercial antennas than it does with non-commercial antennas, such as some of the cheaper antennas. Grab yourself an NMO mount, a new Motorola mount, half wave, toss it in your kit. It's $75 well spent, and then get yourself some NMO mounts that can be attached to the roll cage of the UTV with a couple of radiator clamps, the worm drive radiator style clamps, or if you don't have that, a couple of big Skookum zip ties to attach them. But have a couple of options for clamping an NMO mount onto a pipe or a piece of the UTV. There's a number of different mounts out there. There's some that are designed to mount to luggage racks on trucks that you can maybe clamp around a mirror. There's all kinds of different mounts out there, and yeah, they're a little expensive. Don't buy the Chinese ones. I know you guys hate me for saying, go buy the expensive ones, but I've stripped the threads out of the Chinese ones so many times that you're going to end up buying 10 of them, and you're better off just buying a good one. And if you've got some fabrication skills, you might even want to build some of your own. You can weld up some good mounts out of some, steel that's not flimsy when weight's not such an issue for something like that. That's that's good and stout, and toss that in your kit with an NMO mount added to it. Another thing where that particular issue kind of comes around again is a lot of modern vehicles. I'm looking at you, Ford, with aluminum truck bodies. Well, magnet mount antennas that we throw on everything in an emergency when we need to add a radio don't stick to aluminum because it's a non-ferrous metal. So you got to figure something else out. And in a pickup truck, usually that's pretty easy. You can just clamp something onto the bed rails in the back, or if you're lucky, they've got a toolbox in the back you can clamp something onto. But you got to have some solution for sticking an antenna onto something that's not magnetic, and that becomes a real pain. There's also some truck bed stake mounts that go where the stake pockets are in the truck bed that you can drop one in, again, with that kind of half-wave antenna to get something going. So you need to have a plan for this, and the same goes with like some of the Toyota Tacomas have fiberglass in the beds of them now, and all of those things cause no ground plane issues. I can't use mag mounts, all of those sorts of things. And then after you put the antenna on, we talked earlier about testing your antenna. Well, after you put the antenna up, you need to test that antenna and make sure that you have a good match and you're not going to hurt your radio. And you're probably, a lot of the ham radio community now is looking at me going, but I got a radio installed in my truck. How do I need to be able to do this? I'll just take my truck or my car or my whatever. Well, that's great, except when you get in a disaster and either A, your vehicle is not capable of going, or B, we're all going to ride together in this truck for convoy security reasons. We're putting multiple people in vehicles to reduce the vehicle count. Or third, we're only sending, one or two vehicles out to this site for logistical reasons, and your vehicle isn't capable of pulling the 16,000-pound excavator or the 20,000-pound excavator that needs to come with us. So you're oftentimes, as the communications guy, you're just going to have to jump in a vehicle and go with the crew that's going to do what their vehicles are set up to do the job for. And that may preclude you bringing along your vehicle. Having the ability to quickly, do a temporary install, a mag mount is kind of the entry level of that. And that's another thing, while we're talking about that, if you needed a mag mount locally during Hurricane Helene, you were out of luck. because every radio supplier in 100 miles was sold out of mag mounts because all of the municipalities, because cell phones weren't working, were stuffing radios in every car that they sent out to do anything, and they were sticking mag mounts on top of them. So, that said, we need to talk about radios in these portable situations and powering these radios in these portable situations. There's always the cigarette lighter option, and that works, but it also can have noise issues and a lot of other problems, and frankly, I just don't like to depend on it. But I would have the cable to do it because one is none, two is one, right? Also, having some clip leads for your radio so you can clip onto the battery in the vehicle and run a cable through to power your radio is a good thing to do. Have some good stout battery clips. If you use Anderson power poles to interconnect all your stuff, you can kind of plug and play and mix and match all your stuff and get something power-wise working. And my personal preference on this is actually to use something akin to a man-pack military-style radio that you put together. I have used the company called Armalock. Make some really cool rails to protect your radio, and I have several radios mounted in Armalock rails in a bag with a 10 amp hour lithium battery, and that's enough for me to run in those situations where I'm not using the radio at a high duty cycle at least all day, if not a bit longer. And I can always bring an extra battery and swap it if I need to. And that gives me the ability to run my 50-watt radio at 50 watts for very short communications if that's what I need to do. Because remember, you're just going to be checking in once in a while, or you're calling for help. Maybe you're transmitting for 2 minutes an hour, so your power use is not super high. And then you can grab that radio and you can throw it in any vehicle you want to, hook a mag mount to it or hook a clamp mount to it, and your comm's up ready to go. So that speed and that ability, when everybody's running around like a madman at 7 a.m. or 6:30 in the morning trying to get out of there, and you've got to make this work, make it easy on yourself. Have your gear able to do that. Don't have a tub full of wires and junk that you got to sort through and untangle and hook up. Walk up, throw the mag mount on the roof, or twist the clamp mount onto the roll cage, plug your radio into it, turn it on, and sit down and be ready to go. Or go help the guys that need to load some other stuff. So putting your kits together like that is super critical. You can also, in those situations too, throw a folding, 40-watt solar panel and a little charge controller in. And then when you get to the job site, toss the solar panel on the hood of the truck and plug your radio battery in and top it off. I've done that in several occasions, and I came back with a full battery at the end of the day, just like I left with a full battery, and I didn't have to charge anything overnight. That brings up the next thing on that front. Have a charger. You're going to need to be able to charge your gear off shore power. Some people, we only focus on solar and operational off-grid and that kind of thing, and we plan on charging our gear off solar. Well, that's cool. But if you're doing a high turnover, high operational tempo thing like disaster relief, you may have AC power around, and you may be able to just charge off that, and it's a lot easier. And you may need to do it overnight while you're sleeping, so your gear's ready to go again in the morning. And, that can be very critical. You can also take a 100-amp battery and a 20-amp charger, recharge it in 5 hours while you're asleep, be ready to go, and have a big battery if you happen to be doing something that requires that as well. So think about that modularity. Think about having all your gear so you can quickly move from one location to another, and so that you can quickly set things up and effectively do the job that you need to do as a communications person. Remember, communications, logistics, they roll hand in hand. You're facilitating the mission moving forward. You're not the mission. You're not mission control. You're oftentimes nothing to do with the command decision line. You're just communicating what needs to be communicated. And the guys who are at the top making the decisions are depending on you to be able to make that happen. And they may turn and look at you and go, hey, can you communicate from here to there? and need an answer, and they don't want the details. They don't care how you're going to do it. You just need a yes or no answer. And think for a second and give them a yes or no answer on that, and then they'll continue on with their mission planning. And after that's done, you're going to find out what kind of disaster you just got drug into. And that's just part of it. From a emergency preparedness perspective, that's something that we really have to be prepared for, because it's not just going to be us. We want to do the lone wolf thing. We want to just do our own little mag group, but you need to be able to interface with other people on a larger scale situation. Another kind of item that I want to get into here is power. We talked about charging just then off of AC power, because there's probably AC power available somewhere. There's generators everywhere during a natural disaster. They're very common. You can plug in and charge stuff that way. However, if you find yourself unlucky enough to be somewhere you're going to have to power your gear off of a generator remotely, oftentimes the generators are not what I would call quality generators. They are not Caterpillars or Catalites or things like that. They're not big diesel, quiet, designed for running electronics. They're not, military MP generator or MEP generators. They're not things like that. They're Harbor Freight specials or, Sam's Club specials, and some of them are inverters that are not well designed. And now all of a sudden you have really noisy power, and what you thought was going to be easy because, I'm going into a place that there's no electricity, and that means the noise floor for communications will be really low, and this is going to be a cakewalk because I'm not going to have a bunch of RF noise to deal with from all the electronics and power and everything around. Wrong. The generator's making more noise than anything that was grid tied ever did, and now you're going to have to deal with it. Adding some Trip Light makes some pretty good power conditioners called isobars. If you don't have one of those in your kit, I'd pick one up, maybe a couple of them. Also, some ferrites of the proper type for different types of noise suppression, and have some EMI filtering and other things set up and ready to go in case you do have to operate off of AC power that is noisy, so you can try to mitigate some of those issues that will creep into your communications equipment. And yeah, it's something else to add, but it's something that can be the difference between you pulling your hair out and not being able to receive well, and you having a much easier time that allows you to focus on the mission at hand instead of dealing with chaos and trouble. If you're looking for ferrites, and I have no official affiliation with this company, they're just who I buy my stuff from. Palomar Engineering has some great information on which type of ferrite to use for what type of interference and how to use it. So I'd peruse their website and spend some time learning about that if you want to get yourself up to speed on dealing with electromagnetic interference. Another thing that I'll add to that, and this comes from my days doing live performance and setting up big venues and those sorts of things in a previous life, the general rule was you put your analog audio cables, whenever they had to pass AC power lines, you would cross those at 90 degrees. So there was the least amount of time possible with them running parallel, so that you did not have the opportunity to induce noise onto the other cabling. And this is true in the radio world of trying to keep RF off of our DC circuits and our other stuff. So try to run your DC cabling at 90 degrees to your AC cabling in the field. Try to run your coax to your antennas at 90 degrees so you don't pick up noise from the stuff in your transmission lines. Just try to not run anything parallel with AC power cabling, and that'll remove a lot of your issues as well. So just a pro tip from the guys in the field that have done this for years. Those are a couple ways to try to mitigate interference and RFI. We're going to take a break here and pick up with the second half of this episode next week, as we discuss some more of the technical lessons learned during Hurricane Helene. I want to thank everyone for listening, and encourage you to go visit www.preppernet.net to learn more about PrepperNet. Visit www.preppernet.com as well. Also, check out @GridDownCommsUp, my YouTube channel, for some content that is posted occasionally, very occasionally, on HF Digital and other radio communication stuff. I want to remind everyone that every Sunday night, currently at 2100 Eastern, 20 Central, 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central, for those of you that don't do 24-hour clocks, we do a 40-meter HF Digital net on 7.090 megahertz, upper sideband, using the mode Contestia 4250, which is available in the free software suite of FL Digi. If you understand what any of that stuff meant, we encourage you to come over and join us at 900 on the Waterfall. Say hello and start building that network. We'll pick this up next week with the second half of this episode. 7-3 all, and have a blessed week.
Thanks for listening to the Prepping Academy podcast. Preppers Unite at www.preppingacademy.com.
Has your data been hacked? Do you feel uneasy about the vulnerability of your personal information online? Were you involved in the Target, LinkedIn, or Microsoft data leaks? Don't know? If not, then pay attention. Join Forrest Garvin from PrepperNet for a free webinar on privacy and security. Gain insights into safe internet browsing, VPNs, crafting online aliases, secure emails, detecting if your data has been hacked, and managing passwords. Secure your spot today for this webinar on privacy and security. It's free. This webinar delves into comprehensive strategies for bolstering your online privacy. We've got you covered, from fortifying your passwords to shielding your financial information and mastering state-of-the-art encryption techniques. We're offering 2 convenient dates to suit your schedule. Reserve your spot now at preppernet.com/privacy. Don't let cyber threats erode your peace of mind any longer. Take the first step toward a safer, more secure online experience by joining us for our free webinar. Remember, knowledge is power when it comes to safeguarding your privacy. Sign up now at preppernet.com/privacy. We'll see you there.